Hey, Jeremy here with Fast, and we're going to walk you through the late rent payments and eviction process. So, depending on what your your lease states as far as grace period is going to dictate this. So, our lease is, rent's due on the first and late on the second. Grace periods, really are just a reason to incentivize the resident to pay late. So, you may inherit a lease or have a lease that sort of gives them an extra few business days. Not the end of the world. But rent will get posted on the first. Tenant has, up to 5 different ways that they can pay rent to us. Some doesn't charge a fee, like mailing in a money order or paying with their bank. And then, of course, they want to use a card or something. It may have a processing fee that we don't have control over. So, resident doesn't pay rent. The late notice will get updated in their ledger online. So, they'll have automatic notifications going out about rent payments, rent being late. If they continue to not pay, what we do is we'll go ahead and once the grace period has ended, we will create and deliver a 3-day notice that states the outdue amount and the date that they have to pay by. If they fail to pay by that date or that 3-day notice period expires, which is business days, 3 business days after the grace period ends, we can, if we want to start the eviction process there. Typically, there's a couple variables. We do look internally multiple times a week at the delinquencies. Where are people at? Who's communicating? Who's not? We may get a message from a resident that says, "Hey, I understand I have the late fee there. I am getting paid next Friday," or "I was in the hospital," or "I was traveling," which the excuse doesn't really matter. But as like the fees aren't going to get waived, but it gives us perspective on if the tenant's actually communicating and we are hopeful that they will pay, then that we keep those notes handy. So that's something that we take into account. If the resident's not responding at all to multiple calls, texts, emails, then that starts to raise concern as we get later in the month. So typically our kind of process is we'll get 3-day notices will expire. Generally, once you add in weekends and stuff, that's probably somewhere around the second, week of the month. And so depending on how those second, third, fourth week of the month goes, we don't want it to drag out too long. But again, there's some other factors. If the resident's been there for 4 years and never been behind, that may be something that we take into consideration. But to try to keep a standard, the late notices will post, we'll deliver the notices, and then we'll sort of make a judgment call when it's time to file on that resident and make the recommendation to the owner and go ahead and handle that process for you. So once the 3-day notice expires, like I mentioned, at any point, we can send the file to our real estate attorney to go ahead and get it started. A typical eviction can take about 30 days before we get the final judgment from the court. And after that, we usually pay and schedule the sheriff. So if the resident gets us to that point where a sheriff's called out, we'll meet the sheriff that day, change the locks with the sheriff there, get access to the property and turn it over. Not often is somebody still there when that happens. It's kind of low percentage. I would say out of 10 times, you might get once or twice that the resident's still there at the time when the sheriff's there, and we'll just help them get moved out. But most of the time, there's nobody there. Change the locks, put possessions by the street for 24 hours, and get it removed. There are opportunities where the resident may leave early during that process, during the eviction window, and that's always a benefit. We can take possession sooner, and potentially the resident could have the ability to, if they move out early, or not force us to wait the entire time or pay for the sheriff, that, hey, we might be willing to negotiate and not have the eviction on their record, right? If they leave it in great condition, those are things that we can consider and can negotiate once the eviction has started. If they're willing to do that, vacate the property ahead of time, we may be more lenient on some other things in regards to their sort of case. And so then we also check for utilities. If the utilities are still active during that process, then we also assume the resident's still there. So there have been times where we don't, tenant's not responding, the eviction started, and in a few weeks down the road, we check to say, hey, is the electric and water still active at the city? And if the city says no, there's nothing current, then we know that the property's been abandoned and we can go by. We do want to be careful around, sending our team there just to do like safety checks. Hey, are you still there? So we might do a drive-by. We may not always do it to just see if there's still cars there, but we want to be smart also about, safety concerns about, mental space of somebody that is getting evicted could be dangerous, right? So we just want to be careful, but there are some things that we may do drive-bys, check on utilities to try to see if it's abandoned ahead of time if the resident's not really communicating. So that's kind of our process. There's no extra fees involved for the late fee stuff. Obviously, the residents will pay a late fee. We might charge the resident for delivering a notice. No extra payments needed by the owner during that time. Of course, we're not getting paid either, right? Resident doesn't pay rent, we don't get paid. And so we suffer with you guys. And then when the eviction process starts, typically, I think right now, the time of this recording, you're going to be between $500 to $600. I think right now it's closer to $600 for the attorney that we're using to file all of the paperwork. And then if we have to call out the sheriff, that's an extra like $100, something close to that. It could be slightly, shouldn't be a big difference, but it could be slightly different in real time compared to when this video was recorded. But that'll give you a general idea. So those are just hard costs of the attorney. There's nothing that we get involved in, or we do handle the process, but nothing that we're making money from. We do, however, charge a $297 flat administrative fee for filing all the paperwork, any necessary stuff that happens throughout, and then that also includes sort of meeting the sheriff on site. That can always eat up a couple hours a day on that day alone, depending on what we run into. So it kind of covers all that sort of stuff. It doesn't cover the cost of the lock change. That's more just an administrative thing. And then, of course, there could be extra fees if we have to show up in court, if the attorney has to show up in court. Usually it's just an hourly fee, an extra $150 or $250 or something like that. Most of the time, that's not the case. I would say at least 80% of the time or more, we don't have to do that. We don't have to show up. The attorney doesn't have to show up. So it's safe just to ballpark between eviction cost, attorney, us, sheriff, could be $1,000. Now, if your resident was just placed in the property by us at Outfast, we do have an eviction guarantee that if we have to evict a tenant in the first 12 months, we will pay for the eviction up to a certain amount, and then put a new tenant in for free. So that actually that new tenant placement fee that you might have to pay normally 75% of 1 month's rent, that would get waived in this circumstance just for the 12 months of a tenant that we have placed in the property. So that lets you know that we're standing behind the tenants that we put in there, and that you have some protections there, right? So cost that could also vary. The initial filing would be how many occupants over 18 are in the properties. It could be an extra $50 charge per extra occupant in the property. So there's some small variables there, but in general, it's sort of safe to say, hey, it's just going to be, $1,000 would be a rough idea. And if it's included with one of our guarantees, then it could be nothing or just a very small amount. So hopefully it gives you some perspective on the late fees. And then in the evictions, after somebody's evicted or kicked out, if they have a remaining balance, there are some collection efforts that we go through internally. Obviously, we're not a formal debt collection service, so we can't, there's a lot of things we can't do, but we'll try to follow up for up to 60-day period. And then there's a collection agency that's integrated into our software that we can kick that off to and hope that we sort of collect something at a future time. And then depending on, and most of the times there's not a ton of damage to the properties. Usually it's like junk left behind, some repairs. I think in 10 years, maybe it's happened once that somebody's like vandalized the property, but that's it. So we've been pretty happy, pretty successful over time, not having some of the horror stories where people just maliciously damaging the property, but it's always possible, right? Anything can happen. So generally, if a tenant did a bunch of damage to the property, then there might be, you may want to hire an attorney or hire the same attorney we use to pursue them for a judgment. A lot of times it's not going to be worth the cost or the effort unless it's something that's exceeding probably 10 grand in damages to spend the time of the attorney costs and retainers to like really go down that rabbit hole. But it's definitely a possibility. So we give you all the options. Again, we handle all the stuff for you, all of the process, signing the paperwork, the attorney, you don't have to do anything. We will handle all of that for you. So you can sit back and let us finish our process. So hopefully that gives you clarity. Thanks for watching.